Hi there, and welcome to the final module of this American government course. Um, we're going to be talking a lot in this course about elections, in this module about elections. And this first video of three is one that I want to just kind of paint you a big picture about why elections matter in this country. So, first of all, this I kind of put together with the civil rights and the voting and parties and elections and the media. And the media I won't be getting too much in this video, but it is something that we're going to be focusing on quite a bit more in this module. I wanted to kind of break down the kind of interpretation of history that a lot of people have generously with the American experiment, it's sometimes called. Um, Voting is maybe one of the things that makes the United States feel very inclusive at this point, but it does not have that kind of inclusive history. In fact, it's one kind of paradoxically of making people feel included by allowing people who have not been included in the past, who have been excluded in the past, to be able to vote, to be able to participate in the process. And I think oftentimes in discourse about politics that anyone has, and discourse about voting that people typically have, we see it as a civic duty. We see it as something that we all have to do or we all should do. It's sort of this moral imperative, but sometimes it's more like a chore. It's more of it's kind of a rote routine, and kind of everyone knows who everyone else is going to vote for the most part. Um, so I thought it'd be worth it to kind of go through the context of just how people have been included and excluded over the last couple of hundred years, and you'll forgive me if this is something that you've already learned in history class in maybe high school or another college class. Um, but I think the theme that I really want to drive home today is who counts uh, is really um, is really a very important question. And it's not as if it's a privilege that people, get to do, and, they get to vote. And so that's, it's considered something that it's sort of a matter of dignity. It's really a matter of political consideration and a matter of political calculation. And I want you to see it more as a matter of a an incentive that those in power have to pay attention to anyone, um, simply because they have to. Their offices, their laws, their policies that they enact, that they intend to be beneficial towards them, are really dependent on the consent of people who register that consent through a vote. And so institutions, as we've seen in this election between Biden and Trump, has really mattered in terms of on election night. I don't know if you were watching this as closely as I was, but so many different states had all of these small laws and different time periods of when votes could be counted. Um, and so that matters as far as the election is concerned. But I think, as we've also seen in the last 4 years, when I say institutions matter, I mean who's in government really does matter, and who their constituency is really matters. President Trump famously has had the lowest approval ratings of any modern president, certainly since FDR, and and at least on a kind of consistent whole basis for his entire term. It's been in basically the low 40s the entire time. He often touts that his approval rating among Republicans is like 90%, and that's certainly laudable for himself, and is a show of some kind of you know political strength by Republicans. But the point is that he didn't do a lot, at least to ingratiate himself to those who didn't vote for him, and so that's not typical of presidents generally. And presidents at least make an attempt, and at least for some periods of time, tend to succeed at winning over people on the other side of the aisle. And that's because they know that they're not always going to please the people on their side. And so, what's that Lincoln saying? You can please all the people some of the time and some of the people all of the time, but you can't please all the people all the time. And those all the people tend to be on your side even. So it's really a necessity that for the most part, public institutions like the presidency that are accountable to all people within the United States, and also members of Congress who are accountable to all members of their district, or mayors who are accountable to members of their city, to voters in their city. They attempt to represent as many interests as they can. And I think we saw, at least for now, President Trump's formula of just catering to those who voted for you in hopes that they'll vote for you again, and that'll be enough to, grant you re-election, didn't seem to actually work this time. But that doesn't mean it won't be tried again in the future by other presidents, or other people in office. So, who is it that they have to pay attention to? And I think it's Frederick Douglass who said, and I'm paraphrasing, power never concedes. It only, power never concedes to a request. It only accepts demands if it's forced to. And so that's really true of the American experience in voting. To start off with, in the beginning of the kind of American Republic, especially right after the Constitution was enacted, and you saw, if you watched that video about ratifying the Constitution, those people who were actually participating in voting about the Constitution itself tended to be small farmers and property owners. And they were small farmers who owned property, and homeowners, and they were certainly men, and they were certainly, I want to say 99 to the 99th power white. There may have been one, black farm owner back in the Revolutionary period, or less than 10. But for the overwhelming majority, they were white men, and they were maybe poor. But most of them owned property. Everyone who was voting had to own property according to the laws of their state. And there are many different reasons for that. One thing is simplicity and precedent. Back in that period of time, their main example was British government. And British government had, like we have today, but they still have formally, they have a House of Commons and a House of Lords in their legislature, their parliament. And their House of Commons, even though it sounds like it's for the common people, has never really been, or at least not at least until the 20th century, was never really for the common people. Even in 1832, when there was this great reform bill that expanded the franchise, multiplied it by sevenfold, that still didn't make the majority of British citizens or residents or subjects of the crown able to vote. So instead, what you had was a group of people who mostly were either property owners themselves, and they were certainly all property owners, but they owned some landed property, and they may have been kind of on their way to nobility, and wealthy merchants who were able to vote. So anyone who was not landed gentry from the feudal nobility was someone who could sit in the House of Commons and also vote for the House of Commons. So very few people actually could vote. And this is even surprising because it's after the era of the French Revolution, and you would expect that a lot of countries would have immediately tried to open up their voting procedures and parliamentary procedures to avoid something like a revolution. But that wasn't the case. Britain did go through a couple of periods of revolution that they had already gone through, but they mostly just kind of replaced one parliamentary and monarchical government with another. So with the U.S., they were following the British parliamentary model because it's what they knew, and also because it seemed pretty stable. And they didn't think that in any of their states they needed to significantly expand the franchise because it just simply wasn't being demanded. And not only that, I'll go with the kind of old-fashioned, really arch-conservative paranoia here, and they were afraid that if they opened their voting procedures up too much, that they would start to have people who were antithetical, who were really opposed to their interests, who would try to take too much of their property away in order to run a government that would be for the benefit of the majority of people. So if you restrict the voting to just the number of people who you'd like to represent in government, whose interests are the most like yours, then you have a formula for a government that is going to be in your interests. But if you exclude too many of the people, you get a lot of conflict. And so we'll see what some of that is. So because it just simply didn't add up that they could maintain any sort of semblance of a Republican government or democracy without just breaking down at least one barrier to be able to vote. There were fees associated with voting in many states, and I say many states because every state, even to this day, really has their own voting procedure in the U.S. There are constitutional protections about people being able to vote and participate in the election process, but elections are not at all administered by the federal government. In fact, I would say that it's maybe the most control that states exercise in the federal process still, even in 2020, is the voting process, because it's all governed by their state laws. So initially, many states, like New York is a good example, they liberalized a lot of their voting procedures to the point where you started to see a lot of people join political parties that were like the Democratic Party at the time, the Jacksonian Democratic Party, that was really celebrating the end of this kind of genteel, aristocratic kind of rule by the Washington Adams crowd, and even the Jeffersonian crowd. So the Jackson period is called sometimes the Age of Jackson and the Age of Democracy. But it was really very still centered on this kind of patriarchal white men idea of we already represent all the common people because most people in, say, big states like New York and Virginia who can vote are white men who no longer have to own property. They can be poor, they can be working men, but they're definitely going to be men, and most likely they're going to be white. And in some states, they even started to legislate that, especially in the South. So they eliminated this. I mean all these states eliminated this property barrier, but still a lot of barriers remained. And one of them, of course, was really race and the institution of slavery, which propped up the entire American economy. I would venture to say a lot of historians are now going back and looking at just how integral slavery was to American kind of growth and self-sufficiency, and manufacturing was all dependent on the low cost borne in the entire economy by harvesting crops in primarily in the South. And in the South, a lot at least of the agricultural labor came from people who were enslaved. and had been since the 17th century. And in the 19th century, you would think that it would have died down a little, but in fact, the opposite is true. Because the U.S. started to trade more globally and was starting to be an economic power in and of itself, it grew really rapidly. The practice of slavery and the trade of slavery really exponentially grew. And I don't have access to those numbers right now, but you can just take my word for it that in Virginia and South Carolina, um, even after they banned the international slave trade, or at least the legal international slave trade, the interstate slave trade was booming and was providing the lion's share of agricultural labor upon which the entire American economy depended for their what's today called the supply chain. So, in the North, though, in the increasingly kind of conscious of moral North, the Whig Party and later the newly formed Republican Party was made up primarily of Northerners who may have been business conscious, but also people who were abolitionists and people who were really tired of balancing their economic interests of manufacturing and trade with other countries, as well as their own norms. And there were a lot of religion coming in to U.S. politics and rhetoric at the time. They're really tired of living in the same country as the South, because the South had such antithetical interests, at least in terms of the way they spoke about and the way they dealt with slavery and enslaved people. So it was basically the Civil War was sort of a divorce of irreconcilable differences, right? It was just things that they could not reconcile from the nature of it, both in the economy and the value system of the two countries, and it was probably inevitable that they would try to go to war with each other. The South to try to go its own way, the North to try to maintain kind of its economic dominance over the South. Because even though they depended on the South for agricultural labor, the North, by and large, brought home most of the income and wealth and exercised most of the political power. The South sort of just exercised a veto because they had this leverage, but it wasn't necessarily financial leverage, but it was economic leverage, if that makes any sense. Essentially, it's they were the missing piece of the puzzle for the North's economic system, and even though they only constituted a small part of it, they were maybe the most crucial part. So of course, Civil War erupted, and one of the things that Lincoln learned, maybe from Jackson, was that Jackson, who was elected president in the 1820s first, in the 1830s, and that was when Lincoln was growing up and becoming a lawyer. Jackson and his lieutenant, Martin Van Buren of New York, decided that to form a political party, it would make sense that if they didn't have enough support already in the electorate, that they just expand the electorate a little bit and try to get a few more voters to include, and they can champion the poor voters, for example's cause, to be able to get their votes and ensure their loyalty, and that way that would ensure more of a majority for them. In much the same way, Lincoln saw that he was president of a divided nation. He was certainly a member and somewhat of a leader, I guess, of the anti-slavery Republican Party. But his objective in the Civil War was not to end slavery. It was simply to quash the rebellion and to try to get the country back together again. And if he could do that, and there's this famous quote, of course, that everyone knows, that if he could do it without ending slavery, he would. If he could stop the war without ending slavery, he certainly would. So he did. He did do his best to do just that for the first 2 years. and things weren't going as smoothly as he wanted them to, and many people were dying, right? And the whole brother against brother cliche is true. Like there was a lot of people, a lot of families who were on either side of that northern southern divide, and unfortunately, a lot of the kind of I don't mean to say nostalgia for the war, but the memory of the war that a lot of white soldiers ended up having was of that painful division, rather than of the primary cause of the war being this division about slavery versus human rights. And a lot of the memories of Civil War reenactors they end up forgetting, frankly, a lot of the story about the way of life that was being preserved in the South was one that treated enslaved people as property. And so that is not something that is often enough actually really discussed, despite the kind of prevalence of Civil War reenactments and reunions that happened actually about 50 years later around the turn of the 19th and 20th centuries. But Lincoln decided to enact the Emancipation Proclamation. And the Emancipation Proclamation was this incentive, and it was basically to allow people to be free, or proclaim that people would be free, who decided to support the Union cause. Actually, all the states that were in rebellion, all people who had been enslaved are hereby freed. So that was in 1863, and it would take effect several months later, I believe. But the interesting fact about the Emancipation Proclamation is it didn't free anyone. That in the North, there were still a few states that allowed slavery during the Civil War, states like Maryland and I believe Kentucky, and West Virginia, sort of a new state. But all of these, and Delaware, all of these states that had a lot of agriculture that were sort of in the border South, they were called border states, actually, and they still allowed slavery, at least for the duration of the Civil War. And after the war, of course, the Emancipation Proclamation took effect. And in addition to that, they made sure they passed a couple of amendments that I've mentioned before. So they were called the Civil War Amendments, and they were the 13th Amendment, of course, banned slavery, kind of a reiteration, but also strengthening of the Emancipation Proclamation because it applied to all states. The 14th Amendment, that ensured equal protection and due process of law to all people, regardless of their former condition of involuntary servitude. And finally, the 15th Amendment, the Voting Rights Amendment, that said that any law about voting could not prohibit people from voting who were, who had been enslaved in the past. This is crucial because for as long as the North was keeping a watchful eye on the South, from the end of the Civil War to the end of what was called Reconstruction, 1877, a third of the population in several states could now participate in the election, in any election. And I should say men, of course. Women were excluded from this. But the electorate would increase by a third, or at least as much to supplement as many people who died during the war. And it included a lot of newly enfranchised voters who were able to vote for black candidates for the first time. And for those 12 years, 1865 to 77, Reconstruction seemed to herald a new era in American politics. However, as I believe I've related in another lecture, people in the North grew tired of funding this effort in the South. It was as if the war, even though it ended in 1865, was still going on, and they were just weary, as the electorate can get of this cause, and so as they saw it, and so they made a deal with the South at the first opportunity. They packed up and they left. And in the next, say, 10 years, most all former states of the Confederacy attempted to reinstitute as much of the old system of slavery as they could, and they got around the Voting Rights Amendment through these schemes that most of you have heard of. One of them being literacy tests and that were administered unfairly by county clerks. Another is the poll tax that they would administer again unfairly to white and black residents, and even if they didn't, it was simply a way to keep poor people, at the very least, who included all black people at that point, from the polls, and not to mention the grandfather clause being something that I try to stay away from saying these days because of its heritage. Uh, that if your grandfather was someone who was not legally empowered to vote, then you're not legally empowered to vote. So that's not apparently through involuntary servitude, it's through family ties, but in fact it is a de facto ban on all people who come from families that had slavery in them. And so that seemingly would exclude almost everyone. And then not only that, one thing that's not mentioned often in telling these what are called the Jim Crow laws is the whites only Democratic primary. That just in case you could meet all of those other requirements, the Democratic Party is really where all of the political contests took place in that post Civil War South. And more people voted, in fact, in Democratic Party primaries than in general elections. And there's some question about whether they constituted, there were factions within the Democratic Party that constituted regular parties as we know them, but not really. They were primaries, and sometimes there weren't primaries. But the general election, you get like a 96% of the vote total for the Democratic candidate, and if you voted for the Republican, it meant you were a Northern sympathizer, and that is not going to go too well in any kind of life you want to have in any community in the South for most of the next 100 years after the Civil War. So this is what kind of and racism is sort of the echo of this of anything that was favorable to African Americans during this period, and kind of noises you made about civil rights or things like that were really seen as an echo of the party of Lincoln and the cause of the North and the Union. So civil rights and voting rights were really very much intertwined. And before I expand on that, let me mention one other thing. The Dawes Act in 1924 that did finally enable some Native American voting. But one thing that I don't have a lot of expertise in is the history of Native Americans in the American political system, and that's something I intend to rectify very soon. But for the time being, all I can say is that there were a series of treaties that we all know in U.S. history that Native Americans were essentially cheated out of a lot of their land, in addition to the policy of war against them, especially in the American West. But finally, in 1924, there was this idea that the Dawes Act was supposed to civilize Native Americans and bring them into the U.S. Political and social system finally. And that wasn't without its kind of additional tragedies, right? Like a lot of people were denied their heritage, and a lot of students were through the kind of U.S. educational system that was being imposed on them were made to feel their heritage was barbaric in some way. So the Dawes Act was at least an effort to include via elections the interests of Native Americans that had never been institutionally or socially really integrated into the U.S. Political system. So it was a long history that today I won't say has a happy ending, but at the very least, Native Americans are not as persecuted as they were. But reservations obviously continue to be have among the poorest health outcomes and social outcomes uh, in the United States. So it's really an ongoing tragedy, of course. But let me get back to this whole kind of narrative of civil rights, especially for the black population in the South. So you can see that this idea of exclusion and sympathy for the Northern cause and the kind of cause of black rights is something that is not only alien to, but really um, uh, that people in the South are hostile to for a very long time. And so it really defined American politics and continues to, but in a way that made the South a one party system for nearly a century, and that party system deliberately excluded African Americans for the most part from the system in the South, where the majority of the African American population, by the way,